want to move to your lower body basics program that you released a little while ago. So for those who are not aware of it, can you kind of give the lay-low on what it is? How did you come up with it? What are your biggest influences in building this program?
hmm So initially it was just like I saw that when COVID started, it was a few things. It was a few things. I should go back. So I got really, really busy. Well, I've been really, really busy for a couple of years now. So I'm pretty much like booked out in my calendar for the next month or so. Okay. So it's like, I would love people who can't get an appointment with me for a month to be able to nail all of these things. And like, I'm just creating categories in my head. I'd love them to be able to learn to exhale and get their ribs to move. I'd love them to get a bit of control over their pelvis and their hips move in 3 planes of motion. I'd love their hamstrings to be stronger, their feet, their calves, and their hamstrings to all be stronger and work together. And I know that if someone comes to me with knee pain or foot pain or Achilles or hips or whatever, I'm probably going to be trying to teach them these principles that I teach everyone anyway. So I'm like, okay, I'm just going to create a program that hopefully people can just do. And then when they come to me in a month's time, they are ready to rock. So they're so much better already. We can really get into the nitty gritty. And actually, it's been pretty unbelievable, because people who have booked in like with chronic knee pain for 10 years, they're now when I speak to them, like, okay, 3 or 4 weeks later at the appointment, they've done some of the lower body basics program, and like 80% of their pain is gone already. And they're like, okay, just what's next? What do I need to do? So I don't have to spend the time trying to convince them that they need to do these things. The program has done that because it shows people just how limited they are in some of these movements, you know? So that was one big thing that kind of pushed me to create it. And the second one was COVID started, and people didn't have access to a gym. So 99% of it you can do at home, without really needing any weight. You can hold a baby or something for a couple of the movements, but you don't need much weight at all. So yeah, so it's just all the things I've kind of spoken about already. There's a lot of breathing work, but it's not breathing. Sometimes athletes or coaches will get confused when I'm talking about breathing, and they think like we're talking about trying to get people to connect with God or something like that. It's quite difficult, some of the breathing work, and the goals are with it to actually improve how you move, and we should get tangible results in that. So if someone can't reach past their knees in a toe touch, if someone can't do a squat very well, if someone can't move their hips very well, I would expect if you've done the breathing work in the program, you're going to be significantly better at that stuff. And then there's obviously strength markers where I haven't seen anyone yet who can hit some of the markers on the first few sessions. And I've had powerlifters who are literally some of the strongest powerlifters in the world who can squat a house. And then I asked them to do some of the hamstring bridges that are in the program, and they can't do 5 seconds. So yeah, there's a lot of humbling work in it, but it's just all the things that I'd love for everyone to be able to do. And when they can do it, usually people feel a lot better and move better, and then can move on to other things after that.
So talking about some of those positions that are in the program, I was familiar with the kind of the belly lift from PRI, but then some of the 90-90 with some modifications around like a calf, almost like a calf raise in the 90-90 position. The bridge on the hamstring I find really interesting. First thing that came to mind when I was thinking about those was, why all the cramping in those ranges that we're not aware of? If for people that might not